My director leaned back in his chair, arms crossed, wearing the kind of smile that men like him save for moments they've convinced themselves they've won. "Congratulations to Connor," he said, addressing the room. His fresh energy and modern thinking are exactly what the Lakeview network needs moving forward. The conference room filled with polite applause. I sat at the far end of the table, hands folded in my lap, 12 years of my life pressing down on my chest like a stone. Then I reached into my bag, slid an envelope across the table toward him and said quietly, "Thank you for the opportunity, Richard." He looked at me the way he always did, like I was furniture that had unexpectedly learned to speak. He had absolutely no idea what was inside. "But I need to take you back to where this actually started. Not that morning. Not even the week before, when I first realized what Richard had been building while I kept my head down and did my job. This started 12 years ago, the autumn I walked through the glass doors of Lakeview Medical Centre for the first time, 29 years old, freshly certified in healthcare administration, wearing my grandmother's silver bracelet for luck and carrying a portfolio my mother had given me the night before. I thought I was walking into the career I'd spent my entire adult life working toward. Lakeview was a private clinic network operating out of 3 locations across the Greater Toronto area, offering specialized outpatient services, physiotherapy, diagnostics, occupational health, the kind of facility that sits just alongside the public system and depends entirely on its reputation for efficiency and care. When I joined, the administrative director was a woman named Margaret, practical and fair, the type of leader who remembered your name and your file number simultaneously. She hired me as a patient services coordinator, told me the role had room to grow, and meant it. I threw myself into that job completely. I redesigned the patient intake workflow during my first year, cutting average wait time by 11 minutes, which sounds small until you understand what 11 minutes means across 400 appointments a week. I built the referral tracking system that 3 other GTA clinics later adopted. When our Mississauga location nearly lost its OHRC compliance certification over an accessibility oversight, I spent 3 weekends fixing the documentation and saved us from a 6-figure penalty. Margaret noticed. She promoted me to operations manager after 18 months, then to senior operations manager 3 years later. She told me I was her succession plan. Margaret retired when I was 36. Her farewell card is still in my desk drawer. She wrote, "You'll run this place someday, Elena. I have no doubt." I believed her because she had never once given me a reason not to. Then the board hired Richard. He came from a hospital group in Calgary. Impressive resume, confident handshake. The kind of man who fills a room by deciding he owns it. In his first all-staff address, he spoke about transformation and modernization and aligning our culture with a forward-thinking vision. I sat in the 3rd row and told myself to give him a chance. Leadership transitions are difficult. Every director has their own style. I had been through enough organizational changes to know that patience usually proved wiser than judgment. I gave Richard 8 months before I let myself see clearly what he was doing. It began with small reassignments. Responsibilities I had held for years were quietly shifted to newer hires. Richard brought in people without my institutional knowledge, people who came to me constantly for guidance on systems I was no longer officially managing. When I raised this in a one-on-one, Richard smiled and said he wanted to free up my capacity for strategic work. He said I was too valuable to be buried in operations. I left his office feeling flattered. That was my first mistake. The second sign came when Richard began excluding me from director-level meetings. Not formally, there was no memo, no conversation, just a subtle pattern of "we covered it quickly and I'll loop you in afterward." I started receiving summaries instead of invitations. I started learning decisions after they had already been made. When I mentioned this to Richard, he said he was streamlining the meeting structure to respect everyone's time. He said it so reasonably that I almost believed him. By the end of Richard's first year, I understood the shape of what was happening even if I couldn't yet prove it. I had gone from being the operational backbone of Lakeview to being an expensive, experienced employee that Richard seemed determined to make invisible. I had watched 4 people promoted around me, all of them newer, all of them male, all of them connected to Richard through some previous professional overlap I could never quite trace. Each time, Richard praised my execution and my reliability. Each time, I left his office feeling the particular exhaustion of someone who has been called indispensable and used it as a reason to be passed over. My marriage to Daniel had ended 2 years before Richard arrived. The divorce was not dramatic, we simply grew into two separate versions of ourselves over the course of a decade and finally admitted it. We have a daughter together, Nadia, who was 9 when Richard walked into Lakeview and 13 by the time I slid that envelope across his conference table. I tell you this because it matters. After the divorce, Lakeview became the place where I knew who I was. It was where my competence was measurable, where my decisions had consequences I could track, where 12 years of work had built something real. I was not going to let Richard take that from me without a fight. I just needed to be strategic about how I fought. Connor arrived on a Tuesday in March. Richard announced him at the weekly department head meeting as my nephew, recently relocated from Vancouver, with a background in healthcare consulting. Connor was 26 years old. He had 18 months of consulting experience at a firm that specialized in pharmaceutical marketing, which is not, in any meaningful sense, healthcare administration. He was assigned to work alongside me in operations to get oriented. By his 3rd week, he was attending meetings I was excluded from. I noticed everything about Connor in those first weeks, not out of hostility, but out of the particular attention I had learned to pay to people Richard chose to elevate. Connor was not unintelligent. He was energetic and talkative and genuinely enthusiastic in a way that could have, under different circumstances, been channeled into something useful. But he did not know our systems, our patient population, our compliance obligations, or our staff dynamics. What he knew was how to make Richard laugh during lunch meetings and how to speak confidently about concepts he understood only superficially. I helped him anyway. That is the part I am least proud of. In hindsight, I answered his questions. I walked him through the intake protocols and the billing reconciliation process and the 14 steps required to escalate a patient complaint under Ontario's Healthcare Consent Act. I trained him the way I had trained every junior staff member who came through my department, because that is what I do. Because I believed then that competence was cumulative and that helping Connor become functional served the organization I had given 12 years of my life to. What I did not know, during those weeks of patient explanation, was that Connor was reporting every conversation back to Richard. Every gap I filled in his knowledge became evidence, in Richard's narrative, of Connor's rapid learning curve. Every system I walked him through became part of Connor's onboarding success story. I found this out because of Sophie. Sophie joined Lakeview as our new HR manager 8 weeks after Connor arrived. She was 34, composed in a way that read as reserved until you spent enough time with her to understand it was actually precision. She paid attention to everything and gave away very little. On her 2nd day, she came to my office to introduce herself, and instead of the brief professional courtesy I expected, she sat down and asked me to tell her about the operational structure of the facility. Not the org chart, the actual structure, who did what, who knew what, how decisions really got made. I answered carefully. I had learned not to trust new arrivals too quickly, especially ones hired under Richard's tenure. Sophie listened without interrupting, and when I finished, she said, "That matches almost nothing in the job descriptions Richard gave me for these roles." Then she opened her notebook and asked me to start again, more slowly. That was my first test of Sophie. She passed it by being direct rather than flattering. She did not tell me I was impressive or that she could see I was undervalued. She simply treated the discrepancy between reality and documentation as a problem worth understanding. I appreciated that more than I could explain at the time. Over the following 3 weeks, Sophie and I met for coffee twice Tim Hortons on the corner of Dundas, far enough from the office that running into colleagues felt unlikely. She was meticulous about what she shared. What she eventually told me was this. She had come to Lakeview not just as an HR manager, but as someone who had spent the previous 4 years working on employment equity cases for a law firm in Scarborough. She had seen Richard's specific pattern before, in different facilities, with different names. She was not surprised by anything I described. She was, however, deeply concerned about the documented salary discrepancies she had found in the payroll files during her first week. Richard had been approving merit increases for male staff at an average of 4.2% annually. For female staff at the same tenure and performance level, the average was 1.8%. The gap was not large enough to trigger automatic flags. It was exactly calibrated to stay beneath the threshold of obvious, which Sophie told me was itself a kind of evidence. I went home that night and sat at my kitchen table after Nadia was in bed and thought about the 12 years I had spent believing that if I worked hard enough, if I was reliable enough, if I was indispensable enough, the recognition would eventually come. I thought about every time I had rationalized Richard's behavior as difficult but navigable. I thought about Connor, 26 years old, learning our compliance protocols from me, being prepared by me to take the position I should have held 3 years ago, and I decided that patience was no longer my strategy. Documentation was. I had already been keeping informal notes, a habit I developed early in my career because Margaret always said that in healthcare administration, if it is not written down, it did not happen. But my notes were personal observations, not evidence. Sophie helped me understand the difference. We established our process carefully. I purchased a small digital voice recorder. Ontario's Evidence Act permits single-party consent recordings in workplace settings, meaning I could legally record any conversation I was part of without Richard's knowledge. I practiced activating it while reaching for my pen. I learned to position myself in meetings for optimal audio capture. Within 2 weeks, the recorder felt like an extension of my note-taking routine. My first significant recording captured Richard in the break room, telling our male physiotherapy director that the board's equity initiatives were performative noise from people who have never run an actual operation. The second was more damaging. Richard on a phone call I was passing his open office door during, telling someone I could not identify that Connor was ready to move up and that he planned to restructure the operations file before the quarterly board meeting. He said it would be cleaner if certain long-term staff were transitioned out before the restructure was announced. I stood in that hallway for 3 seconds, processing what I had just heard. Then I walked to the supply room, closed the door, and checked that my recorder had captured it. It had. Sophie, meanwhile, had been working her own channels. Her HR access gave her legitimate visibility into Richard's expense submissions, and what she found there was methodical and brazen. Richard had been billing personal expenses to Lakeview's operational budget for over a year. His wife's fitness membership appeared as a staff wellness initiative. A weekend trip to Niagara-on-the-Lake was filed as a regional network development conference. His son's hockey equipment showed up across 3 separate invoices as facility maintenance supplies. The total across 14 months was just over $48,000. More significantly, Sophie discovered that Richard had been paying an external consulting firm called Meridian North Strategies for advisory services totaling $92,000 over 18 months. Meridian North Strategies was registered in British Columbia under the name of Richard's brother-in-law. The invoices described services so vague: organizational alignment, guidance, and strategic culture mapping, that they were essentially meaningless. The brother-in-law had no demonstrated healthcare administration expertise, no other publicly traceable clients, and had never set foot in any Lakeview facility. We documented everything. Sophie printed nothing from the HR system that she was not already authorized to access. I photographed documents from Richard's unlocked filing cabinet one evening after the cleaning staff had finished their rounds, using the same emergency access code Richard had given me 18 months earlier to handle after-hours facility issues. I felt no guilt about this. Richard had given me that access because I was reliable. He had simply not considered that reliability is not the same as blind loyalty. By the end of our 6th week of gathering evidence, Sophie and I had built a comprehensive file. Recorded conversations demonstrating gender-based bias in promotion decisions. Financial documentation proving expense fraud and a self-dealing consulting arrangement. Payroll analysis showing systematic salary disparity along gender lines, which constituted a violation of Ontario's Pay Equity Act. Personnel records demonstrating that every director-level promotion under Richard's tenure had gone to a man with significantly less tenure and documented performance than the women he had passed over. The board meeting was 6 weeks away. We timed everything around it. In the interim, I continued doing my job with exactly the same quality I always had. I answered Connor's questions. I attended Richard's meetings when invited and stayed professional when I was not. I wore the same expression I had worn for 3 years: attentive, capable, and entirely unreadable. Sophie continued her HR work without deviation from her regular responsibilities. Neither of us discussed our documentation at the office. We communicated by text using a messaging app with disappearing messages and met only at locations well away from Lakeview. The only adjustment I made was in how I managed information. Richard had a habit of using weekly team updates as opportunities to test which employees reported back to him. I began giving each person I spoke with slightly different details about certain projects, nothing harmful, small variations that would allow me to trace the path of any information that reached Richard before it should have. Within 2 weeks, I confirmed that Connor was regularly updating Richard on conversations he had with me and other senior staff. I adjusted accordingly, telling Connor only what I was comfortable with Richard knowing. One afternoon, Connor stopped by my office looking genuinely uncertain, which was unusual for him. He sat down without being invited, which was also unusual, and said that he needed to ask me something directly. He said he had been told, specifically by Richard, that I had been managing my exit from the organization for the past several months and that he, Connor, was being prepared to take over my responsibilities. He said Richard had described this as a mutually agreed transition. Connor looked me in the eye when he said it, and I could see that something in the story had started to trouble him. I held his gaze for a long moment. Then I asked him how long he had been at Lakeview. 5 months, he said. I asked him how many patient complaint escalations he had independently resolved without consulting me or another senior staff member. He was quiet. I asked him if he knew our obligations under Ontario Regulation 965 of the Public Hospitals Act. He was still quiet. I asked him what he thought the gap was between knowing how something is supposed to work and knowing how to actually make it work under pressure at 11 o'clock on a Friday night when a billing cycle has gone sideways and a patient's insurance provider is threatening to flag the account. Connor was silent for a full minute. Then he said, "He's setting both of us up, isn't he?" It was not the ally twist I had expected. I had expected Connor to be another instrument of Richard's strategy. What I had not considered was that Connor might have enough integrity to feel uncomfortable being used as one. I chose my words very carefully. I told him that I could not speak to Richard's intentions, only to facts. And the facts were that I had no knowledge of any agreed transition, and that the role he was being positioned for required competencies that took years to develop. I told him he deserved a mentor who was building him up honestly, not positioning him as a placeholder in a plan he did not fully understand. Connor left my office looking like someone who had just read a document he wished he could unread. He came back 2 days later and asked if there was anything he could do. I told him to keep his eyes open and write down anything that struck him as inconsistent with how a healthcare organization should actually operate. He nodded and left. I did not know yet whether to trust him. But I kept the conversation in my back pocket. Sophie contacted the board chair 3 weeks before the quarterly meeting. Our board chair was a retired family physician named Dr. Patricia Okwu, who had helped found Lakeview 20 years earlier and served in an oversight capacity primarily because she genuinely believed in what the organization was supposed to do. Sophie reached her by email, flagging serious compliance concerns requiring confidential disclosure, and followed up with a phone call. Dr. Okwu agreed to receive our documentation package and review it before the board meeting. We sent everything by encrypted file transfer on a Wednesday evening: financial analysis, recorded conversation transcripts, payroll data, personnel records, and a 14-page summary organized by category of misconduct. Dr. Okwu's response arrived the following morning. It was 3 sentences. She thanked us for bringing this forward. She confirmed she had reviewed the materials. She asked us to be available the morning of the board meeting. The morning of the confrontation, I arrived at Lakeview at 7:45. The sky over the parking lot was the particular flat gray of an Ontario spring morning that has not decided what it wants to be yet. I sat in my car for 4 minutes and thought about nothing specific, just breathed, the way I had taught Nadia to do before her competitive swim meets. Then I picked up my bag, walked through the glass doors, and went to my desk. Richard called the department head meeting for 10 o'clock. He had told me the previous week that it was a routine quarterly update. What he had not told me was that he had also invited Connor to attend in an official capacity and prepared remarks announcing Connor's promotion to Director of Operations, the role I had been performing without the title for 3 years. I walked into that conference room knowing exactly what was about to happen. I watched Richard greet Connor warmly at the door, clap him on the shoulder, guide him to the seat Richard had always reserved for people he wanted to showcase. I took my usual chair near the middle of the table. Sophie was present in her capacity as HR manager, sitting quietly near the door, and she gave me nothing, no look, no nod. We had agreed there would be no signals. Richard opened the meeting with his usual efficiency, moving through budget updates and patient volume projections before arriving at what he called an exciting structural announcement. He spoke about Connor's growth, his adaptability, his fresh perspective on a complex operational landscape. He said the transition would be phased and that existing senior staff would play important roles in supporting Connor's onboarding to the director level. Existing senior staff. That was me. That was 12 years of my life being described as a support function for a 26-year-old who had been in the building for 5 months. I waited until Richard paused for effect. He always paused for effect after announcements he was proud of, and then I reached into my bag, took out the envelope, and set it on the table in front of him. "Thank you for the opportunity, Richard," I said, in the same measured tone I had used with him for 3 years. "I think you'll find everything you need in there." Richard picked up the envelope with the easy confidence of someone who expected resignation paperwork. He opened it with one hand, still half-turned toward the room, still performing for his audience. The first page was a summary cover letter addressed to the board. The second page was the payroll equity analysis. By the third page, which contained a time-stamped transcript of his phone conversation about transitioning certain long-term staff out before the restructure, Richard's hand had stopped moving entirely. The room had gone completely quiet in the specific way rooms go quiet, when everyone senses something has shifted but no one yet knows what. Then Sophie stood up. She spoke calmly, the way she did everything, without drama or performance. She identified herself in her HR capacity, acknowledged the board documentation process that had been initiated, and informed Richard that the board chair had requested an emergency session to begin at 11:45 from now in the third-floor boardroom. She said that legal counsel had been notified and that Richard was asked to remain on site until the board meeting concluded. Richard looked at Sophie. He looked at me. Then he looked at Connor, and I watched something shift in his nephew's expression, not surprise, but something closer to the particular discomfort of a person realizing they have been standing in a room they were not actually meant to be in. Richard attempted the strategy I had expected. He called our documentation an orchestrated attack by a disgruntled employee facing a performance transition. He suggested that I had manufactured a grievance in response to fair organizational restructuring. He said that Sophie had been manipulated by someone with an agenda. He said all of this in a voice that was still trying to project authority while his hands remained motionless on the pages of evidence spread in front of him. Sophie handed him the contact information for the board's legal counsel and said she would let them discuss it further at 11 o'clock. The emergency board session lasted 2 hours and 17 minutes. I know because I watched the clock in the waiting area outside the boardroom where Sophie and I sat until we were called in. Richard spent those 2 hours alone in a meeting room across the hall with the board's lawyer, a detail I learned afterward from the facilities coordinator who had been asked to bring water in twice. When Sophie and I were brought into the boardroom, Dr. Okwu introduced us to the 3 other board members present and thanked us for the thoroughness of our documentation. The financial misconduct, she said, had already been referred to their accounting firm for immediate audit. Based on preliminary review, the expense fraud and the consulting arrangement with Richard's brother-in-law would be referred to the Ontario Provincial Police Financial Crimes Unit. She said this quietly and without drama, the way serious people deliver serious information. There would be a formal process. Richard would have legal representation. But the board's obligation was clear. Richard Thompson was removed from his directorship effective immediately. Security accompanied him to his office to collect personal belongings. His company credit card was deactivated before he reached the elevator. 3 days later, Dr. Okwu called me into her office, Richard's former office, and offered me the interim director of operations role while the board conducted a formal search process. She said the search would be genuine, that I would need to apply through the proper process, and that they could not guarantee the outcome. She said she was telling me this so I could make an informed decision about whether to accept the interim role. I accepted the interim role. And then I told Dr. Okwu something I had been considering for 2 weeks. I told her that Connor, Richard's nephew, had come to me unprompted before the board meeting and expressed concern about inconsistencies in how he had been positioned. I told her that his awareness did not erase the situation he had been placed in, but that it suggested he might have something worth developing if given an honest environment to do it in. Dr. Okwu listened carefully and said she would factor that into the transition plan. The formal search process ran for 6 weeks. I submitted my application on the same day as 4 external candidates. I prepared for the panel interview the way I had prepared for every significant professional moment in my career, methodically, honestly, without performing a version of myself I could not sustain. 2 weeks after the interview, the board offered me the permanent role. Connor remained at Lakeview as a junior operations coordinator, reporting to me, His first week under my supervision was visibly uncomfortable for both of us, which I chose to acknowledge directly rather than pretend away. I sat down with him at the beginning of that week and told him that his uncle's choices were not his choices, that I held no position on who he was independent of how he had been used, and that I was prepared to offer him what any employee at his level deserved: clear expectations, honest feedback, and the actual knowledge he needed to develop real competence. Not positioning. Not performance. Competence. Connor nodded and said, "That's more than he ever actually offered me." I believed him. The first 3 months under my leadership changed the operational climate at Lakeview in ways that were measurable and immediate. Staff retention in the departments that had seen the highest turnover under Richard improved significantly. Our patient satisfaction scores, which had been declining for 18 months, recovered within the first quarter. 2 senior staff members who had quietly begun job searching told me separately that they had taken their names off the market. The pay equity audit that Sophie initiated as part of the board's compliance remediation resulted in salary adjustments for 11 female employees, including 3 who had left the organization during Richard's tenure, and were entitled to retroactive compensation under Ontario's Pay Equity Act. One of those women called me to say she had cried when she received the letter. I told her the outcome was a result of the process, which was true, and then I sat at my desk after we hung up and allowed myself to feel the weight of what had taken too long. Richard's situation moved through its proper channels. The OPP financial crimes investigation concluded 8 months later with charges for fraud over $5,000 related to the expense claims and the consulting arrangement. He pleaded guilty to a reduced charge, received a conditional discharge, and was required to make full restitution $68,000 returned to Lakeview's accounts. He was also banned from serving in a senior administrative capacity in any Ontario healthcare organization for 5 years. I was not involved in those proceedings beyond providing a sworn statement at the early investigation stage. The outcome was not mine to control, and I made peace with that. Justice does not always look like the version we imagine, but it looked like enough. 6 months into my directorship, I was sitting in my office, not Richard's office. I had relocated to a different space, one that did not carry 3 years of bad decisions in its walls, reviewing a staffing proposal Sophie had submitted for expanding our HR function. When there was a knock at my open door, it was Connor. He had a file folder and the expression of someone who had spent time preparing what he wanted to say. He told me he had been working on an analysis of our patient intake scheduling at the Etobicoke location and had found an inefficiency in the handoff process between diagnostics and physiotherapy that he believed was adding an average of 9 minutes per patient to the cycle time. He wanted to know if I had capacity to review his findings. I looked at his analysis. It was careful, well-sourced, and honestly reasoned. The inefficiency was real. The proposed solution was practical. I told him so. "This is what I was trying to learn," he said. "Not what my uncle was teaching me." I scheduled time with him the following week to work through the implementation plan together. Not because I owed him anything. Because that is what good leadership actually looks like: meeting people where their growth is real, rather than where it is convenient. Nadia was at the kitchen table doing homework the evening I accepted the permanent director role. I sat across from her after dinner and told her about it, not the complicated version, just the shape of it. That I had worked a long time in a difficult situation and stayed patient and documented the truth, and the right outcome had eventually happened. She listened in the way teenagers listen, which is to say mostly sideways, and then she asked, "Were you scared?" I thought about the parking garage meetings. The recorder in my bag. The moment I placed that envelope on Richard's table and said thank you in a voice I had practiced a dozen times. "Yes," I said, "but I was more tired of being scared than I was scared." She considered this with the particular seriousness she reserves for things she will think about for a long time. Then she went back to her homework. I sat there for a while after. At the table where I had signed my divorce papers 8 years earlier. Where I had eaten many late dinners alone after Nadia was in bed and the apartment was quiet and the only thing I could think to do was keep going. The best revenge I ever took was not the board meeting. It was not watching Richard receive his conditional discharge or reading the audit results that put $68,000 back into our operational budget. It was the morning 6 months into my directorship when I walked into a staff meeting and watched 12 people around that table do their jobs with the particular ease of people who trust the environment they are working in, who are not managing around a person's ego or measuring what they say against how it might be weaponized. 12 people who came to work knowing that competence would be recognized by the person responsible for recognizing it. That is what Richard had stolen, all those years. Not just promotions. Not just salary equity. He had stolen the organizational culture that makes good people stay and do excellent work. And that is what I spent every day after he left trying to rebuild. If you believe that doing the right thing carefully and patiently can still matter, that documentation is not just bureaucracy but the architecture of accountability, please consider subscribing to the Twisted Bonds. We share stories about the moments when integrity outlasts arrogance. Drop a comment below and tell me, what would you have done differently, and at what point would you have walked out that door? I read every single one.